Forget about playing sports. Women didn't gain the right to vote until about 100 years ago. So you can tell that we're pretty far behind when it comes to relations between the sexes. Notice how the women who were allowed to compete are described here. Upper class women who stayed within the societal norms, and then they were allowed to compete only in sports like golf, tennis, archery, and equestrian or horses, with which are considered sports that were okay for women to compete in. I think the top bullet point here is important to note that males believed their attitudes and actions were the correct way to go about things. They weren't being disingenuous toward women. They just believed uh, that they should only do certain things and be allowed to dress in certain ways. We made it all the way to the 1970s before the opportunity arose for women to compete in sports on the scholastic level. And very few opportunities existed on the collegiate level, which stands to reason because colleges recruit from high schools. So if they didn't have a place to recruit from, how would they go about gaining talent? This began changing in the 1971 when the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women came into being, offering 41 championships in 19 different sports. Notice the difference in the second bullet point between males and females. On the female side, coaches were initially volunteers and players bought their own uniforms and equipment. They traveled in cars and vans and ate fast food restaurants. I also usually point out at this point that if you think about it, many of these things are still true on the NAIA level, except they exist both for men and women. We'll begin going through Title IX now, and most of you are familiar with it, but the road to Title IX success is even one that you probably aren't familiar with. So you can start reading this here. Now, notice the second bullet point here. This is where schools have been getting into trouble with Title IX for a while. They exclude football because there's no real counterpart for football. If you think about football on the NCAA level, particularly for Division One, there are approximately 85 scholarships available. There's no single sport where you have 85 scholarships available other than football, and girls don't play football. The equivalent is volleyball, where you have a fraction of the number of scholarships. So these schools would get in trouble when they would show their equity by excluding football, and the NCAA realized it and told them that that was not being compliant with by Title IX. And then came a Supreme Court ruling in 1984 which said that Title IX was never intended to apply to athletics, which is true, and they resulted in the withdrawing of the Office of Civil Rights suspension of dozens of cases. But colleges and universities were told around the country, do not start eliminating your women's sports. This is a temporary setback and it will be fixed one way or another. 4 years later, the Civil Rights Restoration Act reapplied Title IX. And then 4 years after that, Franklin versus Gwinnett County Public Schools in Georgia strengthened the importance of Title IX by ruling that individuals discriminated against could receive punitive damages. So it took about 8 years for everything to be completely reconciled, but eventually it was. Okay, this is how you become Title IX compliant. Most people think of compliance as equal. You spend the same amount of money on men as you do women. That's not the case. Here's rule number one. Participation opportunities are substantially proportionate the undergrad enrollment of females and males. What this means is if you have 60% of your student body are males, then you can allow 60% of your athletics funding to male sports and only 40% to women. It has nothing to do with 50-50 unless that happens to be your ratio of men and women on your campus. Now, there are three ways to show that you are compliant under this ruling. Three possible issues here. Gender discrimination could persist if an institution cuts men's teams because additional opportunities for women, no additional opportunities for women have been added. And we've seen that in many schools on the NCAA level. You'll see them cutting sports like baseball or like swimming and diving and track and field on the men's side in an effort to get to closer to equal, or showing that they're closer to equal. The second one says colleges have been expected to achieve proportional progress even though other organizations or schools may not be providing equal opportunities for females. And number three, just achieving proportionality does not exempt schools or colleges from the moral obligation to eliminate gender discrimination. Now, the second way to show that you're compliant is if members of one gender have historically been underrepresented among intercollegiate athletics, then there must have been a continuing practice of program expansion to meet the interests and abilities of this group. In other words, you've added a sport for women since you last reported. You don't have to add enough to get you to equal. You have to show that there is progress, and that is all it takes. And then number three says, in the absence of number two, an institution must demonstrate that the interests and abilities of this gender must have been fully and effectively accommodated. What that means is if you show that there's no interest in adding another sport, here's how this happens. There's a local high school where every time they have to report for Title IX to show if they're compliant or not, they call a meeting of all females interested in starting soccer. When they get those there, typically the people who show up to that are players who already play other sports. They explain to them that if you're a volleyball player, soccer and volleyball are played at the same time, so you can't play both. As a result, most of your volleyball players will leave. Then the basketball players are addressed and told that there's an overlap in the seasons, and if you play soccer, you'll be late getting into basketball, and it may hinder your progress there. So typically your basketball players will leave, and by that point, you don't have enough people to field a team. Believe it or not, that's being Title IX compliant. Now, there's one other thing I want you to know about this compliance. You don't have to meet all three of those. You simply have to meet one of the three. That's all. Not two, one of the three, and you are Title IX compliant. Now, there are still issues when you consider the uh, get out of the playing field and consider coaching. Whereas in 1972, more than 90% of women's teams were coached by females, now that percentage is down below 50%. I explain to you sometimes that I don't always agree with what the book says, and this is another issue with that. They encourage you to encourage the NCAA as an entirety to go to the Division III model of no scholarships. I think that while that may be fine in an ideal world, in practicality, that's simply not anything that's ever going to happen or ever going to come to we're going to come to see. I don't know why they address things like that in the textbook.